June 14th, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The heat shimmered above the gravel yard as the transport truck braked hard, sending a cloud of red dust swirling around it like smoke from a distant battlefield. When the rear canvas flap was thrown open, the first thing the women smelled was water, clean, sharp, unmistakable. The second thing they saw was steam drifting from a long wooden building only a few yards away. 50 German women, nurses, clerks, typists, radio operators, sat frozen inside the truck bed. For a moment, none of them moved. They had not bathed in 6 months. Not since Italy. Not since the retreat through France. Not since their units collapsed under the weight of Allied armor in North Africa, or the endless bombardments along the French coast. Their world had dissolved into marches, hunger, lice, and sweat that dried like salt on their skin. Water, when it existed at all, was for drinking. Bathing was a memory from another lifetime. But now, as they stepped down one by one into the Texas sun, they saw something they could not comprehend. The Americans had built a bathhouse for them, a real one. Fresh timber, a tin roof that glinted like a mirror, a metal pipe snaking into the ground, and from the vents along the roofline, steam, warm, white, curling upward into the blue sky. Ingrid Weber, once a Luftwaffe radio operator stationed outside Caen, stared at the sight with her lips slightly parted. The last time she'd seen steam rising from a building, it had been the boiler room of a field hospital in Tunisia, before water shortages shut it down for good. The next day, they were ordered to ration their canteens to half a cup per shift. Behind Ingrid, a former army clerk named Mary Ann whispered, "They made this? For us." It seemed impossible, absurd, cruel even, because nothing that good could be meant for prisoners. A guard approached, an American sergeant, barely older than the youngest of them, with dust on his boots and sleeves rolled above the elbow. He pointed toward the bathhouse and spoke slowly, as if his tone alone might calm them. "You'll wash before processing. Hot water's ready." Hot water. The words clattered inside their minds like loose bullets. For weeks during transport across the Atlantic, they had braced themselves for the worst. They had expected a prison that looked like the propaganda posters back home, barbed wire thicker than a man's arm, guard dogs snapping at their ankles, furnaces, medical experiments, humiliation. But this, a private bathhouse, clean towels piled in neat stacks on a bench outside, rows of tin buckets filled with water so clear they could see the bottom. Nothing in their training had prepared them for this moment. They had been told America was a nation of mongrels and criminals. They had been told surrender meant torture. They had been told the enemy was too weak and decadent to fight without machines. But the place in front of them did not look weak. It looked efficient, organized, purpose-built. And in 1944, America was exactly that. A nation turning out 96,000 aircraft in a single year, destroyers sliding into the Pacific every week, tanks, uniforms, rations, rifles, mountains of them, flowing from factories that never slept. 12 million Americans in uniform, fed by a country so abundant it could still spare meat, coffee, and eggs for its soldiers. And now, apparently, it had spare lumber, spare plumbing, spare manpower, to build a hot water bathhouse for the very people sent to kill them. Ingrid felt her throat tighten with something she could not name, not gratitude, not yet, but confusion so thick it bordered on fear. This was not how victors treated prisoners. This was how hosts treated guests. Around her, murmurs spread among the German women. Is it a trick? Are they cleaning us before something worse? No prison gives hot water. Yet the Americans waited calmly, without shouting, without raising their weapons. The sergeant simply gestured again toward the open door of the bathhouse. Steam rolled gently into the sunlight, a sight so shockingly ordinary. It became unbelievable. Ingrid wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. Her skin was gritty, oily, tight. She smelled herself and recoiled. 6 months of war clung to her like a second uniform. A hot bath. Here, in America, it was the first crack in the armor of everything she'd been taught. And as the women hesitated at the threshold of the bathhouse, half afraid, half longing, the sergeant said quietly, "You're safe now. Go on." But safety, Ingrid thought, was more frightening than danger, because it meant the world she knew might have been a lie. And that was only the beginning. The first woman who stepped toward the bathhouse did so as if walking toward an execution post. Her boots scraped the gravel, slow and uneven, and she kept her eyes fixed on the ground as though avoiding the building itself might somehow protect her. The others clustered behind her, whispering frantically in German, sharp, trembling syllables that cracked under the weight of months of fear. To the American guards, the hesitation seemed strange. To the women, it was instinct. For years, German radio had filled their barracks and workrooms with warnings about the United States. Not warnings about military strength, those were obvious. They had heard the thunder of bombers over Hamburg, had watched the sky turn orange over Caen and Florence. The propaganda was about something deeper and far more frightening, that Americans were barbarians. A people without discipline or honor, a nation raised on greed and violence, a place where prisoners simply disappeared. Ingrid remembered the posters hanging in her training center, caricatures of Americans with crooked teeth, wild eyes, and hands dripping blood. She had heard the stories whispered in bunk rooms, how U.S. troops would beat prisoners to death, or torture them for sport or experiment on their bodies in underground facilities. Every tale more grotesque than the last. None of it questioned, because why would the fatherland lie? And now, when she stood before a building with pipes leading inside, a sealed door, and steam rising from the roof, her mind made the only connection it knew. Chemical chambers, exactly like the rumors. The panic broke all at once. One woman collapsed to her knees, clutching her head, rocking back and forth. Another grabbed the arm of the nearest guard and begged him, in broken English, to shoot her instead. A third pressed her hands together and prayed aloud, tears streaking through 6 months of dust on her cheeks. Behind them, Mary Ann stumbled backward into the group, shaking violently. "They're going to gas us," she whispered. "They want us clean first so it burns faster." The American guards exchanged confused glances. None of them had imagined this reaction. To them, a shower was nothing, not luxury, not punishment, simply routine hygiene. But to these German women, routine had disappeared somewhere between the bombed rail lines outside Naples and the shattered fields of Normandy. Routine didn't exist anymore, only terror did, and terror had been the currency of Europe in 1944. Across the Atlantic, Germany was collapsing into hunger and ruin. Allied bombers had turned the cities into skeletons. Civilians rationed potatoes by the gram. Children gnawed on stale rye bread while their parents whispered fears of winter starvation. Water lines had shattered during raids. Sewage backed into alleyways. Entire districts went weeks without potable water. For soldiers and auxiliaries on the retreat, the situation was worse. Wells were contaminated. Field hospitals ran dry. Rivers were clogged with silt, mud, and debris. Bathing was a luxury none of them had dreamed of. Ingrid had last bathed in January, in a rusted metal basin in a barn outside Foggia, when an Italian woman took pity on her. It had been quick, hurried, with icy water drawn from a nearly empty well. She remembered washing her face 3 times, just to feel human again. That was 6 months ago. Half a year of sweat drying into her hair, dirt caking beneath her nails, and the constant stench of fear settling into her skin like oil. Now she stood in front of a building where the Americans expected her to walk in freely. The gulf between her understanding of war and theirs felt impossibly vast. The sergeant tried to speak again, this time gentler. "It's just a bathhouse," he said. "There's hot water, towels, soap." The women stared as if he were speaking nonsense. Hot water, soap, towels. None of those things belonged to prisoners. not in the world they came from. Behind the bathhouse, the water tower of Camp Hearn gleamed in the sun. Modern plumbing, electric pumps, a network of pipes that fed hundreds of gallons a day through a system so efficient it could be assembled anywhere. The Army needed it. America's infrastructure, refined through decades of industrial growth, allowed even its temporary prison camps to operate with a level of comfort most European towns had not seen in years. In the United States, farms overflowed with wheat, beef, corn, and milk. Factories produced goods faster than the Army could ship them. Cities ran on steady electricity and clean water, even while fighting a global war. Order, stability, abundance. To the German women, these things felt like mythology. Standing before the bathhouse, Ingrid suddenly remembered hearing her commanding officer claim that America's power was hollow, that its prosperity was an illusion built on decadence. But there was nothing hollow about the water tower looming above her, nothing decadent about the precise rows of pipes feeding into the building, nothing weak about a country fighting a two-front war while still finding the time to construct a washroom for its enemies. She felt her stomach twist. If this was the enemy, what did that make everything she had believed? Another woman, Frida, a former medic from Bremen, covered her face with her hands. "It's too clean," she said, voice cracking. "Nothing is this clean unless they want to hide something." Ingrid wanted to speak, to steady her, but she understood that fear too deeply to deny it. The sergeant took a small step forward. He didn't raise his voice or touch them. He simply walked ahead, opened the bathhouse door wider, and let the steam spill out into the sunlight. Warm, white, harmless, but the women flinched as if he'd opened a furnace. Ingrid's chest tightened. She wasn't sure what frightened her more, the fear that this was a trap, or the possibility that it wasn't, that the Americans truly meant no harm, that the world she had been shown through German broadcasts had been a distorted imitation of reality. Behind her, someone sobbed. Another whispered a prayer. A third muttered, "God forgive us if we walk into this." The sergeant looked at them. Really looked. Something in his expression softened, as if understanding, for the first time, the depth of what they carried with them. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You're in America now." To him, that sentence was simple. To the German women, it was incomprehensible, because safety was not a word they associated with the enemy. Not yet. But the bathhouse door stood open, the steam lifting like a gentle invitation, while the women trembled on the threshold of a world they had never imagined, a world that, even in war, somehow held on to order, dignity, and decency, a world that would terrify them in a way cruelty never could. For a long moment, no one breathed. The bathhouse door stood open, steam curling lazily into the Texas sun, and 50 German women trembled before it, certain that one step inside meant death. And then, in a twist so sudden it felt impossible, the young American sergeant did, something none of them could have predicted. He walked straight into the gas chamber. Boots on, uniform on, hat still tucked under his arm. He didn't hesitate. He didn't explain. He simply stepped inside the room they feared most and reached for the nearest valve. The metal handle screeched, pipes rattled, and then, hissing, rushing, unmistakably warm, water began pouring down onto his shoulders in a steady curtain. For a heartbeat, no one moved. To the women, it felt like watching a man walk willingly into fire. But the sergeant only pushed his hair back, blinked through the spray, and said with a crooked grin, "See, just water, nothing else." The silence that followed was heavier than fear itself. Ingrid felt her knees weaken, not from terror now, but from the sudden collapse of all the dark expectations she'd carried across Europe and the Atlantic. The sergeant stepped fully beneath the stream, letting the water soak his shirt until it clung to him like a second skin. He held out his hand as though inviting them across an invisible line. "It's safe," he said again, softer this time. "You're safe." For the first time since capture, his voice didn't sound like an order, it sounded like reassurance. The first woman to move was the last one anyone expected. Frida, the timid medic from Bremen who had spent the train ride to Texas, curled silently in a corner of the carriage. Her breath shuddered in her chest as she stepped forward, inch by inch, until she reached the doorway. She touched the air first, testing the warmth of the steam, half believing her skin would burn. It didn't. Then she crossed the threshold. Her boots tapped against the concrete. 1 step, 2, and she stopped directly beneath the showerhead beside the sergeant's. When the hot water hit her scalp, her eyes fluttered shut. It was the first gentle thing that had touched her in half a year. And then something inside her broke open. She began to cry. Not the muffled whimpers she had let slip during nights on the cargo ship, but deep, ragged sobs that echoed off the tiled walls and spilled out into the yard. The sound washed through the group like a shock wave. One by one, the other women moved. Ingrid stepped in next. Then Marianne. Then the nurses from Naples, the radio operators captured in Caen, the auxiliary clerks who hadn't washed since Tunisia. They entered as if stepping into a chapel, heads bowed, hands shaking, each waiting for the sting of poison that never came. What met them instead was warmth. Pure, steady warmth. The water ran brown at first, clotted with sand, dust, dried sweat, and the grime of retreat. But slowly the streams lightened. Dirt slid off their skin in dark streaks, swirling across the floor and disappearing down the drains. Hours of marching. Nights hiding in barns. Days working in ruined hospitals. Entire chapters of the war flowed off their bodies and vanished. Ingrid pressed her fingers to her cheek, shocked by the softness beneath. She hadn't felt clean skin in months. Beside her, Marianne rubbed her arms again and again, whispering, "Es ist warm." My God, es ist warm. One of the younger women laughed, a short, startled sound as if she'd forgotten the shape of it. Another tilted her head back and opened her mouth to the stream, letting clean water fill it until she coughed. For the Americans watching, the moment was strange and humbling. To them, a shower was as ordinary as sunrise. To these women, it was salvation. What none of the prisoners knew, not yet, was that this kindness wasn't accidental. It was policy. By 1944, America understood a truth Germany's leadership never grasped. A well-treated prisoner is a quiet prisoner. A quiet prisoner requires fewer guards, and a prisoner who sees his captor's humanity goes home carrying that message. The bathhouse at Camp Hearn wasn't a luxury. It was strategy, one shaped by the Geneva Convention, by American values, and by a belief that decency could do what bullets never could. Every act of mercy was deliberate. The hot water, the fresh towels, the soap milled in Ohio factories, the plumbing routed by Army engineers who built airports in a week and hospitals in a day. In a world on fire, America had chosen to fight with steel, yes, but also with dignity. And dignity, in its quiet way, was a weapon more powerful than any bomb. As the women washed, the sergeant stepped outside, water still dripping from his uniform. His fellow guards stared at him, half amused, half in awe, and he shrugged as if walking into showers wasn't the strangest thing he had done in the war. Behind him, the women's voices echoed softly through the doorway, some still crying, some laughing shakily, some whispering to one another in disbelief. Ingrid stood beneath the spray until her fingers wrinkled. She touched her face again, then her hair, feeling strands loosen and fall free from the mats they'd formed. She felt the heat sink into her bones. She closed her eyes and let the last 6 months wash away. For the first time since the war began, she felt human. Not a uniform, not a number, not an enemy. Human. And in that moment, she sensed, without fully understanding it, that something greater than cleanliness was happening. Something that belonged not to the battlefield but to the heart. For the first time, she believed the Americans might not be monsters. And that realization frightened her far more than any threat ever could. Outside, the sergeant sat on the steps of the bathhouse, wringing water from his sleeves. A corporal beside him shook his head and muttered, "Hell of a thing you did in there." The sergeant smiled faintly. "They were terrified," he said. "Someone had to show them." The corporal nodded slowly, looking toward the open door where steam still curled into the evening light. "This is the part they'll remember," he said. "Not the fences, not the guards, this." The sergeant didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Inside, the sound of running water continued like a hymn, soft, steady, and impossibly gentle in a world that had forgotten what gentleness felt like. And as the women washed away the last fragments of a collapsing Europe, a different kind of victory unfolded in that small wooden building. The victory of mercy. The victory of American decency. The victory that made even the enemy whisper. Maybe we were wrong. For a moment, the bathhouse sounded almost peaceful. Just water hitting concrete, just quiet breathing, just the faint rustle of towels in American hands. But then, like a fault line giving way beneath the weight of a collapsing world, the silence fractured, and the breakdown began. It didn't start with a scream. It started with a sob, small, muffled as if someone were trying to swallow it, then another, until the bathhouse echoed not with fear anymore, but with grief so raw it cut through the steam like a blade. Frida was the first to fall. One moment she stood beneath the water, her head bowed, hands trembling. The next, her knees buckled and she sank onto the wet concrete, clutching the bar of soap the sergeant had given her as if it were the last warm thing left in the world. She held it to her chest, rocking slightly. "In sex monoton," she whispered. Ich. In 6 months. I. Her voice dissolved, strangled by tears. Ingrid turned toward her, stepping out of her own shower stream, hair plastered to her back, and for the first time she saw Frida, not as a fellow auxiliary, not as a soldier, but as a girl barely older than herself, skin stretched thin from hunger, ribs visible beneath the water. Frida let out a sound that wasn't quite a cry and wasn't quite a gasp. It was something deeper, something primal. A grief older than the war itself. Behind Ingrid, Marianne pressed her palms over her face. When she pulled them away, her cheeks were streaked with grime that had melted into muddy rivulets. She stared at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. "If this is death," she whispered, voice shaking. "Why is it warm?" The question hung in the steam like a ghost. Outside, the American guards had stopped pretending they weren't listening. One leaned against the wall, arms folded but jaw clenched. Another stared at the open doorway, eyes narrowed not in suspicion but in something closer to sorrow. The sergeant who had stepped under the shower still stood barefoot on the steps, drying his hair with a towel he'd borrowed from the supply crate. He looked young again, no longer the calm leader from minutes earlier, but just a farm boy from Pennsylvania who'd enlisted because his brothers had gone first. A private beside him shook his head. "She's crying like she's dying in there." The sergeant exhaled slowly. "They all are." Another guard murmured half to himself. "They're scared of water." "Goddamn hot water?" "No," the sergeant replied quietly. "They're scared of mercy." The private blinked. "Huh. They were taught we'd hurt them." The sergeant rubbed the bridge of his nose. "But we didn't. That's worse for them. It breaks something." A third guard let out a low whistle. "They're terrified of hot water more than they were of our rifles." Christ. He wasn't wrong. What played out inside the bathhouse wasn't relief. It was collapse. 6 months of dirt washed away. 6 months of hunger loosened its grip. 6 months of propaganda shattered in the space of a few minutes. And when the body softens after months of hardness, when warmth touches skin that remembered only cold, the heart can't hold the line anymore. The breakdown spread from woman to woman like a wave. One knelt beside Frida, wrapping her arms around her shoulders. Another leaned her head against the tiled wall and wept openly. A third pressed her forehead to the water pipe, whispering prayers in German and Italian, mixing languages the way trauma mixes memories. Ingrid stood still at the center of it all, water running down her spine like a memory she couldn't place. Her own tears came slowly, not in choking sobs but in trembling drops she didn't bother to wipe away. She lifted her hands and stared at her fingers. Pink skin, wrinkled from water, clean. She didn't recognize them. She didn't recognize the girl inside them either. Behind her, Marianne sank to the floor, covering her face again. "We were told," she said, voice trembling, "we were told they would torture us." "And instead they gave us soap," Ingrid whispered. The words tasted strange in her mouth. True. Impossible. Dangerous. The worst part wasn't that America had failed to hurt them. The worst part was that America did not even want to. Beyond the bathhouse walls, the world in 1944 was still burning. Germany was starving. Italy was collapsing. France was still smoldering. Civilians rationed scraps while cities crumbled under Allied bombs. But here, in Texas, in a camp built for the very enemies those bombs were meant to break, there was hot water, there were towels, there was enough soap for every prisoner. America, even in war, had enough to share. Enough food, enough water, enough dignity, enough decency to give comfort to those sent to fight against it. The guards knew it, too. The older ones had grown up in the Dust Bowl. The younger ones remembered the Great Depression. They knew hardship, they knew sacrifice, but they also knew abundance, American abundance, and they guarded it fiercely, even with strangers. One guard watched the steam rise and said softly, "My ma never let nobody go hungry during the Depression. Fed folks at our door even when we barely had enough. Guess the Army figured the same." The sergeant nodded. "Being decent ain't weakness," he muttered. "Not in this country." As the women's sobs echoed through the bathhouse, the men fell silent. Not out of confusion now, but out of respect. Because something sacred was happening inside that wooden building. Something larger than a bath. Something older than war. A group of enemy women, frightened, exhausted, half-starved, were realizing, perhaps for the first time in their lives, that mercy was real, and that their enemy possessed it in impossible abundance. Ingrid finally sank to her knees beside Frida. The water poured over them both as if trying to rewrite everything they had carried into America. Fear, lies, indoctrination, despair. For the first time since her capture, Ingrid let herself feel the full truth. If the Americans had wanted revenge, they would not have given her warmth. If they had wanted humiliation, they would not have given her privacy. If they had wanted obedience, they would not have given her dignity. She pressed her forehead to the concrete and whispered, barely audible over the running water, "What if everything we believed was wrong?" Frida squeezed the bar of soap harder, and outside the sergeant closed his eyes, because he understood the moment better than any of the women inside. This wasn't the breakdown of morale. It was the breakdown of hatred, the beginning of something new, something fragile, something profoundly American. And it was only the beginning. The morning after the bathhouse incident, the guards froze in disbelief. Frida, who had collapsed sobbing in the showers, was now standing at the fence, waving shyly at a private as he passed. Marianne, once convinced every American was a monster, was asking a guard how to pronounce "thank you" in English. And Ingrid, the one who had trembled like a hunted animal, was carrying her towel under her arm and politely requesting, "May we bathe again today?" For a second, the Americans just stared. Yesterday, these women had begged not to be killed. Today, they were smiling. It felt like watching the enemy step out of a nightmare and into the light. That was when the guards realized something astonishing. Their kindness hadn't broken the prisoners. It had transformed them. Life in an American POW camp was not luxury, but by 1944 standards, especially compared to the ruins of Europe, it felt like abundance. The women received 3 meals a day, averaging 3,200 to 4,000 calories, far more than most German civilians, and sometimes even more than American families still rationing sugar, butter, and coffee for the war effort. Meals were served on schedule, never missed, never reduced. Eggs, potatoes, bread still warm from the camp bakery. Beans, corn, beef stew, sometimes even fruit. For women who had eaten black bread so stale it had to be soaked, the consistency alone felt unreal. The camp had a library, stocked with English paperbacks, German titles donated by universities, and even a few French novels someone had collected during training. There was a music room with an upright piano dented at the edges but perfectly tuned. A garden plot where prisoners grew tomatoes, onions, and herbs to add flavor to their meals. Work assignments rotated: laundry, kitchen prep, clerical tasks, tending the gardens, mending uniforms, helping in the infirmary. American guards supervised, but the atmosphere drifted closer to a small town than a prison. The shock wasn't in the freedom, it was in the normalcy, a normalcy they had not known since 1939. 3 days after the showers, a supply clerk distributed hygiene items. The women lined up, expecting cheap soap and coarse towels. Instead, each was handed a small tin jar. "Skin cream," the clerk explained. Many of them didn't understand. Frida turned the tin in her hands, confused. For what? The clerk smiled. "For your hands, for your face. Keeps the skin from cracking." Cracking? They were used to skin cracking. They were used to split knuckles, bleeding lips, windburned cheeks. Moisturizer had vanished from German stores in 1942. Most of them hadn't seen a jar since the first air raids on Hamburg. Frida opened the tin and gasped, soft, white, fragrant. She dipped a finger in and nearly cried again. Behind her, Marianne unfolded the towel she'd been given. White, thick, plush. "It's soft," she whispered, "like clouds." Ingrid laughed, an actual laugh, and held the towel to her cheek. No American guard mocked them for this moment of awe. They only watched, half amused, half humbled. But the moment that truly shifted the atmosphere came a week later. It was noon, hot, dusty. A group of American guards sat outside the mess tent sharing their allotted sodas, brown glass bottles beading with condensation. A young Texan private noticed Ingrid watching the bottles with cautious curiosity. "You ever had a Coca-Cola?" he asked. She shook her head. The private held out the bottle. Ingrid blinked. "Oh no." "Nein. It is for soldiers," she stammered. He smiled and extended it again. "It's for you." She hesitated, sensing a test. But when she finally took it and pressed it to her lips, cold sweetness burst across her tongue. Her eyes widened. Marianne gasped. Frida clapped a hand over her mouth. 2 others stared in disbelief. Soda was something they had only heard about in magazines before the war. The private grinned. "Welcome to America." That was the first time the women laughed with the guards, not at them. The first time they sat on the same bench. The first time an American soldier realized these enemy women were no different than the sisters they'd left back home. The Americans didn't offer kindness blindly. There was purpose behind it. Washington knew that treating prisoners well created ripple effects. A well-fed prisoner didn't try to escape. A respected prisoner didn't sabotage work. In assignments, a humane environment made guards safer, calmer, more effective. But there was a deeper strategy, one few prisoners recognized until the war ended. The United States wanted its captives to return to Germany one day and tell the world, "America treated us with dignity." The War Department understood something profound. Mercy outlives war. Compassion rewrites propaganda. Humanity disarms hatred long after the guns go silent. And the strategy worked. Decades later, thousands of German POWs would write memoirs describing America as the most humane captor of the war. Many returned to visit. Some immigrated. A few married Americans they met after repatriation. Families today still send letters to county museums thanking small Texas and Wisconsin towns for kindness shown in 1944. But inside Camp Hearn, The women didn't know any of that yet. They only knew that the enemy fed them, bathed them, clothed them, and spoke to them with a respect they had not expected from anyone, least of all from victorious soldiers. At night, when the camp quieted, Ingrid sat on her bunk writing in a small notebook she'd hidden during transport. The pages had been torn from a field manual, but they still held ink. She wrote, "When we stepped off the truck, we believed we would die. Instead, the Americans gave us water, food, and kindness. Each day, a little more of the hatred we carried dissolves." She paused, staring at the ceiling beams. "Germany taught us fear. America gives us dignity. What will remain when the war ends?" Her pen hovered. Then she wrote the line she didn't dare speak aloud. "If this is the enemy, I no longer know what we were fighting for." Outside her barracks, the sergeant from the bathhouse made his rounds. He paused to listen to the soft hum of German voices inside. No longer whispers of panic, but something gentler. Conversation, laughter, singing. He smiled to himself. This, he knew, was the America he believed in, the America his parents had raised him to serve, the America that still felt possible, even in the middle of a world war. If only, he thought, America could hold on to that spirit forever. Because watching the women adjusting to life inside Camp Hearn, he couldn't escape a question that echoed like a quiet prayer. When did we stop being the country that did things like this? Can we ever be that country again? He didn't know the answer, but in 1944, inside a sunlit Texas prison camp, America was still a place where mercy was stronger than fear, and kindness was as powerful as victory, and the prisoners, once terrified, now transformed, were living proof of it. The shift didn't announce itself with speeches or ceremonies. It revealed itself in a single, startling moment that made one American guard stop mid-stride and whisper, "What in God's name?" The German women, once terrified, silent, rigid, were now gathered around the bulletin board outside the mess hall, helping each other pronounce English words they had copied in shaky handwriting. "Thank you," Marianne said, cheeks pink. "Good," Ingrid nodded. "Try again." Yesterday, they feared being shot. Today, they practiced kindness. It was the kind of twist that made even the Americans stare in quiet awe, because something profound was happening, something no rifle or tank could have accomplished. The prisoners were changing from the inside, and for the first time, they wanted to. The awakening began in their journals, scraps of ration paper, torn pages from old German manuals, the backside of Red Cross forms. Anything that could hold ink became a place where truth finally surfaced. Ingrid wrote, "The Americans do not need to treat us well, but they choose to. I do not understand this country." Marianne's handwriting shook across the page. "We arrived with hatred. We will leave with shame." Even Frida, who had barely spoken since the retreat through Italy, wrote by lantern light long after her bunkmates slept. "If mercy is weakness, then America is the weakest nation on earth. But I think, perhaps mercy is strength." These were not political reflections. They were human ones, born from the collision between fear and unexpected dignity. The contrast with home made every kindness sharper, almost painful. Their minds kept returning to Germany in 1944. Families boiling weeds for soup, children crying in cellars as bombs shook the walls, cities burned into charcoal grids, mothers using scraps of blanket to warm infants while their husbands froze on the Eastern Front. Ingrid's family lived in Hamburg. The last letter she had received, 3 months before capture, said simply, "Food is gone. We pray for spring." But here, in an American camp thousands of miles away, she ate beef stew twice a week. She drank milk. She touched towels soft as feathers. She slept on a cot with clean sheets. She showered with hot water whenever she wished. The contrast was unbearable. One evening after supper, a German woman named Elise stood before the bathroom mirror, her hair still damp from the shower. She stared at her reflection in disbelief, cheeks no longer gray, skin no longer tight and cracked. She lifted her fingers to her face and whispered, "This is the first time since 1942 I look like a human being." And when she said it, she cried, not because she looked better, but because she finally understood how much war had taken from her, how much kindness was giving back. The guards felt it too, perhaps more deeply than the women realized. The same young sergeant from Pennsylvania who had stepped into the showers fully clothed kept replaying that moment in his mind. Enemy women collapsing, weeping, clutching soap like salvation. He had enlisted believing the enemy was monstrous. He had expected hardened Nazis, fanatics, killers. But instead, he found dozens of girls barely in their 20s, hungry, exhausted, trembling not from hatred but from lies. One evening, he stood at the perimeter fence with Private Lopez, watching the women carry laundry baskets back from the washroom. "They're just kids," Lopez murmured. "Kids who got dragged into a madness they never made." The sergeant nodded slowly. "Seeing them cry like that in the bathhouse." He shook his head. "That wasn't politics. That was fear. Pure fear." "And what did we do?" Lopez asked. The sergeant looked out at the prisoners, women now laughing softly as they walked, hair clean, shoulders no longer slumped. "We washed them," he said. Simple words. But they carried something weighty, something American. They didn't torture the enemy. They didn't starve them. They didn't break them. They washed them. And in doing so, something else was washed away. The hatred those women had been taught, the propaganda that had shaped their worldview, the fear that had clung to their bones. The Americans offered dignity not because it was easy, but because it was right. And the guards felt themselves grow in that truth. In the barracks, the awakening spread like a tide. The women wrote letters home, letters the censors allowed through, telling their families, "We are safe. We are treated better than soldiers. Tell the others, surrender is not death." Some learned English phrases, some helped American medics treat, but each carried a story that defied everything Europe believed about war. The enemy treated us with mercy. In the years that followed, the women built new lives from those ashes. Some became teachers. Some became nurses in hospitals rebuilt from the ruins. Some became translators, embassies eager for those who understood both sides of the ocean. And some, quietly, humbly, became storytellers. They told crowded classrooms, "I feared Americans more than bombs, but America fed me." They told their children, "Your mother came home because the enemy refused to be cruel." They told neighbors in bread lines, "Do not hate them. You do not know what they did for us." And every time they spoke, they chipped away at the last remnants of the ideology that had poisoned their youth. Kindness had outlived the Reich. Some returned to America decades later, not as prisoners, as visitors. They traveled to Texas, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, some with children, some with grandchildren, hoping to see the places where their understanding of humanity had been rebuilt. Many found only grass fields and cracked foundations where barracks once stood. A few signs, a memorial stone, rusted wire half swallowed by vines, but some found more. A former guard, now in his 70s, who offered them coffee on his porch. A town historian who had kept the camp's POW registry carefully preserved. A church lady who remembered her mother baking pies for the German girls. A rancher whose father once hired POW women to help herd cattle during labor shortages. And everywhere they went, they were met with the same words. "We're glad you came back." A few wrote memoirs. Thin, fragile books printed by small German publishers. They rarely sold more than a few hundred copies. But inside them were lines that cut deeper than any military report. "We arrived with hatred. We left with humility. America taught us the weight of dignity. Compassion is stronger than ideology." One woman wrote a sentence that historians still quote today. "The Americans defeated us not with bombs, but with decency." For Americans reading these accounts, especially those whose fathers or grandfathers had served, the stories struck a chord that echoed through generations. There was pride, deep, swelling pride. Because the greatest generation had done something almost unthinkable. They treated their enemies better than the world treated civilians. Better than the enemy had treated them. Better than they had to. Even in war, even while rationing sugar, butter, gasoline, they had saved space for mercy. Today, that feels like another world, and American audiences hearing these stories often ask the same quiet question. Do we still have that kind of moral strength? Are we still the country that chose kindness even when we didn't have to? The question lingers, heavy but hopeful, because remembering the past is the first step toward reclaiming its spirit. For German American families, the feeling is even deeper. Many have written to small-town museums and state archives. My grandmother survived because of American compassion. My father always spoke of Texas with gratitude. Our family exists because an American soldier shared his rations. Gratitude has outlived the war by nearly a century, and yet the most powerful legacy injured prisoners. Some even hummed along with the radio broadcasts drifting from the guardhouse. Every act was small, every act was enormous, because each kindness eroded another layer of fear, and beneath the fear was humanity. As weeks passed, the women began to discuss something unthinkable months earlier. Not why America hated them, but why America didn't. Why a nation so powerful chose mercy instead of vengeance. Why soldiers who had lost brothers on the battlefield still offered soap and bread to the enemy. One morning in the garden plot, Ingrid put her thoughts into words. Germany taught us that power comes from force, she said quietly, but America shows power through kindness. Which do you think will last longer? Marianne pulled a weed from the soil and replied, The bombs may end the war, but this. She gestured toward the camp, the guards, the steaming bathhouse across the yard. This will end the hate. The women fell silent, because they knew she was right. By late summer, the awakening had become impossible to miss. The guards noticed it, the women felt it, and anyone passing through Camp Hearn sensed it in the air, like the soft echo of a truth too large to ignore. America was not winning only with factories, planes, or soldiers. It was winning with decency, winning with restraint, winning with a moral code so strong it reached across barbed wire and touched the people they were supposed to hate. Ingrid wrote a final line in her journal that summer. America defeated. Us long before our armies fell, not with force, but with goodness. And in those words rested the quiet truth of the entire war. The greatest victory America ever achieved was not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of its enemies. The revelation didn't arrive with fanfare. It revealed itself years later, quietly, unexpectedly, when a letter written in shaky German script arrived at a county historical society in Texas. The curator read it twice, stunned. The opening line felt like a twist no one could have predicted. America did not wash our bodies. America washed our hatred. It was signed by a former German POW woman, now a grandmother living in Hamburg, and her story was not unique. When the war finally ended in 1945 and repatriation orders swept across the American South, the German women of Camp Hearn boarded ships with a strange heaviness. They carried no anger, no bitterness. Just small satchels filled with things the Americans insisted they keep. A towel still smelling faintly of camp soap, a bar of chocolate wrapped in wax paper, a pocket dictionary scribbled with English phrases, a photograph taken beside the camp garden, guards and prisoners smiling in the same frame. Most of them had nothing else to take home. Germany was rubble. Their families were starving. Some returned to cities that no longer existed on maps. Others arrived to find their parents gone, houses burned, streets unrecognizable. The city of Camp Hearn belongs to the women themselves, those who carried the memory across continents and across decades. One autumn afternoon in 2004, a woman named Elise, 80 years old, walking with a cane, returned to the old site of Camp Hearn with her granddaughter. The barracks were gone. Weeds swayed where guard towers once stood. Only a rusted gate frame remained, leaning slightly, the metal warm under the Texas sun. She walked toward it slowly, touched the iron with a trembling hand, and whispered in German, "I came here as an enemy, but America helped me find my humanity again." Her granddaughter, born long after the war, took her hand gently. "What do you remember most?" she asked. Elise smiled, a soft, fragile smile. "The hot water," she said, "and the kindness." Then she added the line she had written in her diary 60 years earlier. "America did not wash our bodies. America washed our hatred." And that is a legacy of the greatest generation. A legacy not of conquest, but of conscience. Not of domination, but of dignity. Not of vengeance, but of mercy. A legacy that still whispers to every American today. Be as strong as they were. Be as principled as they were. Be as kind as they dared to be, even to their enemies.